Hi guys, welcome back. We're getting into the types of irrigation now. Just left off with what irrigation was, drawbacks and problems to it. So again, if you need to review that, please go backwards, watch part four's video, and we'll be good with that. So when we look at the types of irrigation, we're bringing water from elsewhere and putting it onto our agricultural fields to help it grow. The way that we used to do this traditionally was with one of these two methods, furrow and flood. These are going to be primarily practiced in the less economically developed countries currently. The more economically developed countries have the money to put into fossil fuel energy to do spray and drip irrigation. Of these two, the better method is drip, but we don't use that very often because it costs a lot of money to put the system in place. We have to have lots of hoses and drippers, and it puts the water directly onto the roots. So you can see we have a very high efficiency. We're only losing 5% of our water through evaporation and runoff. However, uh, it's going to have a cost associated with that improved efficiency. So only the places that can really afford to pay that higher cost really makes sense to use this. You see drip irrigation in orchards a lot because those are going to be perennial plants that come up in the same place every year. A tree doesn't change where it grows at. It stays there year after year after year. So I can put those drip systems in and I can surround that tree trunk with that dripper. That way, around here, the water is going to be draining and putting right onto the plant's roots, exactly where it needs to be. If I'm a farmer and I'm planting rows of crops, one year my row might be here, but the next year it might be off a little bit, and I might have my rows here the next year. So the drip systems are going to be running right along the crop from the year before, dripping onto that row. If my row's off a little bit, now I have to pay somebody to come in and move my drippers to be dripping on the new row of crops. Now, with GPS technology and tractors that are run by computer and they can precisely plant in the same spots year after year after year, we may start to see drip becoming more common on large scale farms because it's much more efficient and they would be saving water. But right now, farmers don't worry about the cost of water because it's pretty cheap. But as we see water becoming, and we'll learn about that in a few chapters from now, if we charge the same price as we did for water as for gasoline, we would see massive reductions in the amount of water we use. When you go to the grocery store, you can buy a gallon jug of water for 95 cents. You can't buy a gallon of gasoline for 95 cents. And we have, just as much scarcity of water as we do of gasoline worldwide. So if we were charging the same true cost of water, farmers would be more prone to save the efficiency any way they could. They would start shifting more towards this drip method, then using GPS technologies to make sure they're planting their rows exactly where they're at each year. That way, those drip systems would already be in place and be able to water the crops. And again, I think we'll eventually see that becoming more prevalent and more common. But as of right now, they're not having artificially high prices for water. Instead, they're having artificially low prices for water, and they're not worried about their efficiency too much. So they're more apt to use the spray irrigation method. That spray irrigation method still gets pretty good results. This 25% that the book has, I think that's way off. Usually it's somewhere around that 10 to 15% loss. So it makes it a really, really good process, and it's not all that expensive. The sprinklers that you're talking about, there's going to be a cost associated with them, but a lot of times they're mobile and movable. So if I have 5 big fields, I can get the same sprinkler and water those 5 big fields with the same one. Because once I'm done watering this area, I just move it over to the next field, it waters this, then I come back, water this one, and I keep on bouncing it around as I go. So again, the original ways we did irrigation were more with these because we didn't have the fossil fuel energy to run pumps strong enough to take the water long distances. Now we have improved pumps and we have fossil fuel energy available to us. We can start to use those spray systems with pressurized lines and spray the water hundreds of feet through the air, pump it from hundreds of feet under the ground or from hundreds of miles away. So spray is becoming more popular in the MEDCs. The LEDCs are still using this furrow and flood. Now, I know these methods don't mean anything to you yet because you've never really seen them or experienced agriculture. When we look at what these look like, and again, before we move on, what you're looking for when you're looking at the irrigation is the efficiency rate of them. That's what determines if it's a good method or a non-preferential method. So this furrow method, again, had a 20% efficiency, or sorry, no, I'm sorry, this one was a 33% inefficiency, meaning we lose 33% of all water used, about a third. So the reason why we lose so much, if you look at these furrows, this is the furrow here, that little row in between the crops. So if we're looking at it from a side view, I would have my crops growing here. My furrow is in between those. And I would have a series of those little mounds where my crops are growing. The roots are going to be growing through those little dirt mounds, and I flood the water in between those dirt mounds. That's going to allow lateral recharging of water to the roots. So it's going to laterally feed the roots with water from the flooded furrow. The problem with that is the sun's shining down on that water, heating it up and causing massive evaporation. That evaporation never reaches the roots of the plants. That's our intent of irrigation, is getting to the roots of the plants. In addition to that, some of the water is going to be seeping straight down, never coming in contact with the roots, and other water is just going to keep on washing straight out of the field without ever being absorbed. So we're losing tons and tons of water without really ever accomplishing the goal of what we're trying to do, which is water the plants. So furrow irrigation is not very good, but if I have a river nearby my farm, I can reroute that river water to feed those furrows, and I'm not really out anything because I'm not paying for the water. That's why, again, the less economically developed countries use this a lot. We still see it in America, but it's not nearly as common. Flood irrigation, again, this is what they do in rice paddies, places like that. They'll flood the entire field. Your efficiency goes up. We're only losing about 20% now. And the reason why we're only losing 20%, there's a lot more water actually hitting the roots of the plants, because really the only loss we have here is that sunlight hitting and evaporating the water off. Since it's flooding out the entire field, most of that water is going to be hitting the roots and getting to where it needs to be. So again, those are the two original types that we did it forever. LEDCs still do them. MEDCs are shifting more towards this spray irrigation because now we're getting into that only 10 to 15% loss. But again, this is going to be a high input type of agriculture because now we have to pressurize the lines to be able to spray this water in all directions. This is one method of it where the sprayers are kind of moved in between the rows. The other type is with these huge wheeled apparatus, and these wheels move through the field and keep on going through. They call this center pivot. And the center pivot agriculture is what creates those big circles of crops, because this would be the central point where the water hose comes up. It feeds that sprinkler, and the sprinkler is going to run around and pivot around that central point. And as it pivots around, that's what's watering the roots and creating that lush agricultural land. Spray irrigation is one of the reasons why we now have more farmland available to us, because we were able to take arid areas like are in these pictures. This is desert all around it, but we're able to create that farmland within the middle of the desert because now we can bring water to that area. Where it used to be too arid to grow crops, now we can grow them. So again, that irrigation, fairly efficient, but there's going to be cost associated with it. And we're able to open up new agricultural areas. So farmers are able to make more profit by using it, which is a good thing. The next type is going to be our drip irrigation. Again, this is the best one we should be using, but it's the least commonly used. So this is our best method, but our least commonly used. And again, the reason why it's least common is because these hoses cost money. With a spray irrigation like we had in the previous picture, you are going to have costs associated with it. But again, it's not nearly the cost that we would think. This method here would have more cost because you can see the hoses are there. But I can still pull those out, take them to a different field, or move them from year to year. With this drip method, now I can see I have these little fittings that run down through each of the rows. This happens to be a strawberry farm, and you can see with this, those hoses are dripping within those strawberries. Strawberries are what's called a perennial plant, meaning they come up year after year after year. So they're perennials. This drip irrigation system works really well for perennial plants because I don't need to move my drippers. Over here, this is corn. Corn and drip irrigation don't go very well together because as that corn stalk gets big, I plant it in this area this year. Next year, it might be a completely different area that the corn seed goes to. Now I need to pick up this little hose, move it to a new area, provide the water. In addition to that, for a cornfield, I may have 12 miles of hosing that I need to buy. to purchase 12 miles of hoses, it's going to cost a lot of money. And any little hole in that hose is going to affect the system. All that stuff needs to be maintained and monitored and all. So where I have perennial plants, it makes better sense to use this because I don't have as much upkeep and much maintenance and as much moving around of the pipes. I keep the pipes in that same spot year after year after year. So it's the best method to use, but it's the least common because most of our agricultural fields are using annual plants that we plant each season and then harvest and regrow the next year completely from scratch. And again, the high cost associated with it is what makes it the least commonly used. But it's the most efficient. We're only seeing about 5% or less loss with this method. All right, so again, when we look at the effects of irrigation on our water supply, uh, it has a big impact on the amount of water we have available. We have three big consumers of the water worldwide. We have residential, industrial, and then we also have agricultural. So residential usage, again, we're looking somewhere around 10% of the total water used worldwide is residential use. Industrial is about 20%, and then agricultural is about 70%. We don't really think too much about this because we're used to seeing, you know, industrial and residential use. We think that these are the two biggest consumers of it, but we're incorrect in that thought. We in Pennsylvania don't experience agriculture as much as what somebody in Idaho would or somebody in Montana. But those farms use huge, vast amounts of water, mainly for irrigation. So when we look at this, agriculture is our biggest consumer of water worldwide, and that has major impacts. We don't worry in Pennsylvania because we have so many rivers and lakes and streams that we have lots of fresh water available to us. But if we were in an arid, drought-ridden area, we'd be pretty angry that a lot of the water that we're needing is going towards farm animals and towards growing vegetables that we don't really care about. We care about drinking enough water to survive. So if I lived in the desert, for instance, I'd be really angry that agriculture is taking 70% of the water when I don't have enough fresh water for my family. So the thought that residential and industrial are the two largest consumers that most people have, that's an incorrect idea. So we have to get away from thinking that and get it into our head that agricultural is the largest consumer of water. So that's the first impact we have. Second impact is aquifer depletion. We'll talk about what an aquifer is here in a second. But the big thing that you want to put in your notes here, it's due to overpumping. And we'll talk about this, kind of keep this slide open as we go on to the next part of the video here and take a little more side notes. Fertilizer runoff is another problem with it. As we're applying the synthetic fertilizers to the field, we coat them with that synthetic fertilizer, then we go through and irrigate. And if we're over applying the irrigation water, there's going to be a certain amount of runoff happening. As it runs off, that fertilizer is being carried along with it. And that fertilizer then can wash into a stream, a lake, etc. And that's going to carry that pollution then downstream. Or it's going to allow the water to soak into the ground, and the ground then is contaminated with that fertilizer elsewhere. We see problems with eutrophication as a result of this. And if you don't know the eutrophication process, you need to Google it and you need to understand it because eutrophication is a big thing as far as this class goes. Anytime we have nutrient level spike, we're going to see increased algal growth. Increased algal growth then blocks sunlight, which stops photosynthesis. The algae then eventually starts to die off. The decomposers eat the algae and rob the water of oxygen. We end up with those hypoxic dead zones then as a result of it, and the fish species begin to die. And last problem, again, salinization. You can flip back to the problems with salinization from the last video, watch that and understand that. All right, so aquifer depletion. We said we'd come back to this. First thing we have are two types of aquifers, confined and unconfined. And you can probably get the idea of what the difference is between the two just by looking at the picture. A confined aquifer is sandwiched in between two impermeable layers. Here we have clay and bedrock sandwiched in. So this confined aquifer is unable to be recharged. Once we drill into it with a well and use the water, it's never going to replenish. So this would be a non-renewable resource. Right? Once we drill out a hole into it and tap into it for a well and we pump that water out, we're left with a void in the rock that has no water in it. When we don't have water in it, now it's just gases in those voids, and gases can easily compress. So we have the ability for subsidence and ability for collapses of that aquifer to the point where it could never ever be refilled again, even if something happens to that clay layer. The unconfined aquifers are what we're more commonly using for our irrigation. We drill wells down into them, we pump that water, we take it elsewhere, and that's what we use to irrigate the land and create farmland with. All right. Problem with that is if we overpump that, that water table then goes down. We're left behind with empty voids, which are filled with gases. Those empty voids then can collapse in on themselves, and we have ground compaction. When those empty voids collapse in on themselves, the aquifer collapses, and there's no way to reinflate it with new water. Those air pockets need to be there for the water to have a place to go. So if we collapse these in and sandwich them in, now we've depleted that aquifer and we can't bring it back and store water in there anymore. So what we need to do is keep that aquifer healthy, and we want to do that by that maximum sustainable yield. Remember how we look at what the recharge rate is or the growth rate. We want to harvest it somewhere along that line or below that line so that we're always making sure we're replacing what we're taking. If we start harvesting it above that maximum sustainable yield, now we start having a depletion of the aquifer, and it will never replace itself. That aquifer then has the potential to start to collapse. Doesn't mean it has to collapse, but it has the potential to collapse and be unusable for the future. So when we look at the largest aquifer in the world, it happens to be in the United States, and it's the Ogallala Aquifer. And again, I'm probably not pronouncing that right. I apologize to anybody that might get offended if I pronounced it wrong. But it's this giant aquifer that spans, I think it's like 9 different states last time I counted. So when I look at it, this is going to be a common resource that all these states are sharing. And truly, it's the entire United States sharing this access to this resource because our agricultural sector is all through this area here. This is our main area that we grow most of our crops. So they're all going to be pulling that water from that aquifer or nearby river systems to grow those crops. So we need to keep that aquifer healthy and functional. And in order to do that, we have to make sure, again, we're using it at or below that maximum sustainable yield. We're not doing that right now, though. That aquifer is huge, and we're over pumping it. We're over pumping it for agricultural reasons and for irrigation reasons. So when you look at this picture here, we see up in the northern part, blue is good, orange and red are bad. So we see that this area actually has more water than what it did. I forget how many years ago this map is looking at, but there's a change in depth of the water to the point where this is an increase in depth. This down here is a decrease in depth. So what we're seeing is we're over pumping near New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, etc., Louisiana. Up here in Missouri, Idaho, Iowa, places like that, we're seeing massive amounts of flooding happening in those areas. That flooding is seeping down into the ground and recharging that aquifer, but it's not recharging equally. And we're seeing an increase in depth here and up here and a decrease in depth down here.